If you want to understand the single most dangerous environment for an older adult, you really shouldn't look at icy sidewalks in the winter.
Right, or steep staircases.
Exactly. Don't look at slippery bathtubs or uneven pavement. You have to look at their own bedroom. Specifically, you need to look at that bedroom at exactly 2:0 a.m., right at the moment their feet hit the floor in the dark.
It is a profoundly vulnerable physical state, and, it's entirely predictable, yet it catches families completely off guard every single night.
Yeah, we usually think about medical diagnoses with this expectation of precision, right? Almost like mechanical engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is, broken.
Right, it's clean and binary.
It is, and frankly, it's comforting. We like things to be visible. But when you step into the world of home caregiving, specifically navigating the nighttime environment for an aging loved one, that metaphorical x-ray machine is just completely broken.
It really is.
We are looking at a safety landscape that is murky, both literally and figuratively. I mean, we're talking about the fact that a third of adults over the age of 65 experience at least one fall each year, and over a quarter of those falls happen at night.
Usually right in the middle of what seems like a simple trip to the bathroom.
Right, and we have to stop calling them accidents, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. That terminology implies randomness, and a 2.0 a.m. fall is rarely just a random trip over a rug. It's a result of a highly complex collision. You have biological factors, environmental hazards, and neurological changes all crashing into each other in the dark.
So it's a systemic failure.
Exactly. It's a systemic failure, not a stroke of bad luck.
Okay, let's unpack this. That is our mission today. We are going to build a comprehensive, step-by-step, highly actionable checklist for family caregivers.
Which is so desperately needed.
It really is. If you are listening to this and you are managing the home safety of a loved one, we are designing this in-depth expert guide specifically for you. You do not need a medical degree to implement this, but you do need an understanding of the mechanics at play.
Right, because we want to give you the precise tools to prevent nighttime falls and wandering incidents.
Exactly. We are synthesizing a massive stack of data to do this. We're pulling from clinical sleep medicine studies, cutting-edge dementia research, automated home safety protocols, and geriatric care models. And the goal here is not to turn their home into a padded cell.
Far from it. Wrapping a loved one in bubble wrap is it's a very common caregiver instinct. It's driven by fear, but it's ultimately counterproductive.
It just creates new problems.
It does. Our objective with this checklist is to implement strategic, evidence-based interventions that preserve three vital things: independence, dignity, and sleep quality.
Because if you sacrifice those in the name of physical safety,
You aren't solving the problem. You are just creating severe psychological and physiological new ones. To do this right, to build this checklist properly, we have to start by looking at the raw physiology of the night.
we really have to understand why the human body is so profoundly compromised when the clock strikes 2:0 a.m.
Exactly. Before we can build the safety net, we have to understand the biological adversary.
And this brings us to a really fascinating clinical study from East Tennessee State University, the ETSU study. This research completely reframes the conversation, I think, because they weren't looking at frail individuals in nursing homes, right?
Right, and they weren't looking at people with severe dementia either.
No, they were looking at perfectly healthy, independent, late middle-aged, and older adults. The average age was around 64 to 65.
And that specific demographic choice by the researchers is precisely what makes the findings so relevant for you as a caregiver. We often assume that falls only happen to the deeply unwell.
Which just isn't true.
Not at all. The ETSU researchers wanted to see what happens to a healthy, older adult's standing balance and their gait, their walking mechanics, when they are abruptly awakened in the middle of the night.
So what did they actually do in the lab?
So they brought these healthy individuals into a clinical sleep lab. They let them fall asleep, allowed them to sleep for 2 hours to reach a deep state of rest, and then abruptly woke them up.
Sounds jarring.
Very. And they immediately tested their visual acuity, their standing balance, and their walking mechanics. And they did this across 4 completely different lighting conditions, ranging from practically pitch blackless, then 0.5 lux, all the way up to standard bright room-level lighting around 200 lux.
And the results from those tests absolutely shatter the illusion that simply flipping on a bright overhead light switch solves the problem of waking up in the dark.
Completely, because the deficit isn't just about photons hitting the retina. It is about neurology. The researchers measured highly specific biomechanical metrics to prove this. One of the key metrics was stride velocity variation.
Which means what, physically, when someone is actually walking down a hallway?
Think of a healthy gait as a metronome. When you walk normally, the speed of your swing phase and your stance phase is highly consistent. Your brain's motor cortex and cerebellum are perfectly timing the muscle contractions in your legs.
So it's a steady rhythm.
Right. Stride velocity variation measures how inconsistent that speed becomes. The other major metric they tracked was center of pressure displacement.
Ah, the micro sways.
Exactly. When you are just standing still, you aren't actually perfectly still. Gravity is constantly trying to pull you down, and your body is making thousands of tiny, involuntary microcorrections through your ankles, knees, and hips to keep your center of mass balanced.
Just to keep you upright over your feet.
Right. That is your center of pressure path length. The ETSU study found that even in these entirely healthy adults, both their stride velocity variation and their center of pressure displacement were significantly, measurably worse during the mid-sleep awakening compared to their pre-sleep baseline.
So their bodies were literally swaying more, struggling to remain upright, and their steps were erratic and uneven.
But here is the critical insight. Exposing these individuals to bright, room-level lighting during that mid-sleep awakening did not instantly fix this physiological unsteadiness.
Wait, really? The light didn't help their balance?
No, not instantly. The balance and gait impairments remained entirely present, regardless of whether the room was dimly lit or flooded with 200 lux of bright light.
Because the problem isn't the room, the problem is the brain. It makes me think of a pilot trying to fly a commercial jet while the operating system is still booting up.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the hardware, the leg muscles, the joints, and the software, the brain, the vestibular system in the inner ear, they are physically there, but they just aren't communicating with each other yet.
Right. The brain is suffering from sleep inertia.
So you can flood the cockpit with as much light as you want, but if the flight computer is still loading its basic code, the plane is going to fly erratically.
That is a highly accurate mechanical analogy. Sleep inertia is a documented physiological state of impaired cognitive and sensory motor performance that happens immediately after waking.
And what's happening chemically during that state?
Well, when you are in deep sleep, your brain is bathed in certain neurochemicals, like adenosine, which promote rest. When you wake up abruptly, those chemicals don't instantly vanish.
They sort of linger.
Exactly. The frontal lobe, which handles executive function and complex coordination, is essentially lagging. So you have this inherent, inescapable neurological deficit. But sleep inertia is only the very first layer of the vulnerability.
Right, because we also have to layer on the cardiovascular changes, specifically the mechanics of orthostatic hypotension.
The dreaded head rush. Most people have experienced this if they stand up too fast from the couch, but in an older adult, at 2:00 a.m., the stakes are massively higher.
Unimaginably higher. Let's break down the hydraulics of the human body here. When your loved one is lying down flat in bed, their cardiovascular system is operating on an even horizontal plane.
Right, the heart does not have to work very hard to pump oxygenated blood to the brain because it isn't fighting gravity.
But the moment they swing their legs over and stand up, gravity asserts itself. It immediately pulls a significant volume of blood down into the legs and the splanchnic bed in the abdomen.
Blood pools downward, away from the brain.
Exactly. In a younger cardiovascular system, this isn't a problem because of baroreceptors, right?
Yes, these are specialized pressure sensors located in the carotid arteries in the neck and in the aortic arch. They constantly monitor blood pressure.
So they sense that drop immediately.
The millisecond a young person stands up and the blood drops, these baroreceptors detect the loss of stretch in the artery walls. They instantly fire a signal to the medulla in the brainstem, which sends a surge of sympathetic nervous system activity.
Meaning the heart immediately beats faster.
Right, and the blood vessels in the legs firmly constrict, squeezing the blood right back up to the brain. It happens so fast you don't even notice it.
But the aging process degrades that exact mechanism.
It degrades both the sensors and the vessels. As we age, our arteries naturally stiffen arteriosclerosis. Because the arteries are stiffer, the baroreceptors embedded in them don't stretch as easily, they become less sensitive.
So the senior stands up, the blood drops into their legs, but the baroreceptor reflex lags.
The signal to constrict the blood vessels is delayed or weakened. Consequently, the brain is temporarily deprived of optimal blood flow and oxygen.
Which induces dizziness, severe lightheadedness, and that temporary loss of visual field we call graying out.
And a massive, instantaneous spike in fall risk. So, picture the caregiver's reality for a second. You have a loved one waking up. They are fighting sleep inertia. meaning their motor coordination is erratic and their vestibular balance is swaying.
And then they stand up.
They stand up, and orthostatic hypotension hits, depriving their lagging brain of oxygen and making them dizzy. This alone is a crisis. But then we add the most dangerous biological catalyst of all urgency, nocturia.
The overwhelming physiological need to urinate at night. We often talk about nocturia like it's just an annoyance, a reason you don't get a full 8 hours of sleep.
Right, a nuisance.
But in the context of fall prevention, it is the ultimate hazard. It's like a fire alarm going off in a building where the sprinkler system is broken and the stairwells are missing.
That's exactly what it is. It induces a state of physical panic that entirely overrides executive function and whatever physical caution the senior might usually exercise.
Because the biological urgency forces them to rush.
It compels them to move faster than their compromised balance and sluggish blood pressure can safely handle. They ignore the dizziness because the brain is screaming at them to get to the bathroom. And the clinical data on this is incredibly sobering.
We are pulling from deep research highlighted by the University of Washington and broader sleep medicine literature here. If you are a caregiver, listen to this math because it frames the exact scale of the problem.
The numbers are startling.
If an older adult has 2 nocturnal voids, meaning they wake up twice a night to use the bathroom, their statistical risk of falling increases by 1.84 times compared to someone who sleeps through the night.
Almost double the risk.
But if they have 3 or more voids a night, their risk of suffering a hip fracture increases by 80%.
An 80% increase in hip fracture risk. And a hip fracture in an older adult is not just a broken bone. It is a catastrophic, life-altering event that drastically increases one-year mortality rates.
And that 80% spike is driven almost entirely by the physical act of rushing in a biologically compromised state to urinate.
Exactly. And yet, we still haven't discussed one of the most critical sensory inputs, the eyes. We have to factor in ocular adaptation.
The aging eye. Because even if your loved one has perfect prescription glasses, and even if they aren't dealing with active diseases like macular degeneration, glaucoma, or cataracts, just the standard, healthy biological aging process physically changes how the eye reacts to light.
Let's look at the anatomy of the iris. The pupil is the opening that lets light hit the retina, and its size is controlled by 2 muscles. You have the sphincter pupillae, which constricts the pupil to block out glaring light, and the dilator pupillae, which opens it up in the dark.
And what happens to those muscles as we age?
They atrophy. They lose their elasticity and their fast twitch responsiveness.
So the mechanical aperture of the camera is rusting.
Essentially, yes. When a younger person moves from a pitch-black bedroom into a glaring white bathroom illuminated by standard bulbs, their pupil snaps shut in a fraction of a second to prevent retinal bleaching.
But in an older adult, this pupillary reflex is sluggish.
Extremely sluggish. When they hit that wall of light in the bathroom, their pupil remains dilated for far too long. They experience a prolonged period of temporary blindness and intense visual disorientation.
It's called glare recovery time, right?
Right, and it degrades significantly with age. They're literally blinded by the light right when they're trying to navigate around a door frame or avoid a bath mat.
While they are dizzy from standing, staggering from sleep inertia, and rushing because of nocturia.
It's an absolute perfect biological storm.
So the fundamental question for the caregiver is this. If the physical body is this deeply, unavoidably compromised at 2 a.m., how do we physically manage the act of getting out of bed?
Because you can't cure sleep inertia.
Right. You can't magically restore arterial elasticity to fix the blood pressure, and you can't install younger eye muscles. So what is the actionable step?
You engineer a physical routine. You cannot fix the biology, so you must control the behavior.
Okay, how do we do that?
Well, because we know these specific physiological deficits exist, and crucially because we know they are temporary, the sleep inertia lifts after a few minutes, the blood pressure stabilizes, the eyes eventually adapt, we must design a highly specific, non-negotiable, step-by-step physical routine.
For your loved one to follow the exact moment their eyes open.
Yes. In geriatric care, we call this the Launchpad checklist.
So what does this all mean? The Launchpad. This is where we move from understanding the biology to implementing the actual safety checklist in the bedroom.
Exactly. We have to create a highly controlled, flawlessly engineered environment right around the physical bed.
Because if the launch is safe, if we manage those first 3 minutes, the subsequent walk to the bathroom has a vastly better chance of success. Let's break down the exact staging of this routine.
The foundational rule of the Launchpad is breaking the act of rising into distinct, enforced stages. You have to train your loved one, and if they have cognitive decline, you have to prompt them consistently that they can no longer go from lying flat on their back to walking in one fluid motion.
It is mathematically too dangerous.
Large dangerous. Stage 1 is roll to the side and sit up, swinging the legs over the edge of the bed. Stage 2, remain seated on the edge of the bed for a rigidly designated period.
Mhm.
We usually prescribe counting slowly to 15 or 20.
You are explicitly waiting out the orthostatic hypotension.
Right. You are forcing a pause to give those sluggish baroreceptors in the carotid artery the time they need to realize, oh, the body is up right now, gravity is pulling the blood down, we need to signal the heart to pump the blood back to the frontal lobe.
You sit and you actively wait for the dizziness to pass.
It is a mandatory systems check before takeoff. But, and this is a massive engineering caveat, for this staging to actually work, the bed itself has to be calibrated correctly.
This is huge. One of the most frequent yet easily preventable mistakes well-intentioned caregivers make is ignoring bed height.
It happens all the time. The professional biomechanical consensus is absolutely clear here. The bed height must be adjusted so that when the senior is sitting on the edge, their feet rest completely, flatly, and firmly on the floor, while their knees are bent at a perfect 90-degree angle.
This just comes down to basic physics and leverage, doesn't it? Let's visualize the extremes. If the bed is too high, perhaps a thick mattress on top of a tall box spring, their feet are dangling in the air. And when they try to transition from sitting to standing, they cannot push straight up. They have to slide off the edge.
Which means they are engaging in a state of controlled falling before they have even established their center of gravity or tested their balance. Their base of support is compromised from the first millisecond.
And conversely, if the bed is too low, maybe a low-profile platform bed, their knees are elevated up near their chest when they sit.
Right, and to stand up from that position requires immense quadriceps strength and core power to thrust their body mass upward against gravity.
And that sudden, forceful upward thrust drastically throws off their center of mass, creating a massive forward momentum shift precisely when their vestibular system is reeling from sleep inertia and their brain is deprived of oxygen.
It's incredibly risky. Adjusting the bed frame, removing a box spring, or swapping out the mattress thickness to achieve that exact 90-degree knee angle with the soles of the feet completely flat on the floor is a non-negotiable foundational safety step.
Okay, what's next on the Launchpad checklist?
Assistive devices. The immediate tactile environment. You must install sturdy, medically approved bed rails or assist handles that slide securely between the mattress and the box spring.
And we need to be incredibly specific here. We are not talking about using a heavy bedside nightstand. We are not talking about gripping the edge of a heavy oak dresser.
Never use furniture. Furniture tips, it slides on carpets, and it is not ergonomically designed for a human hand to grip while bearing weight.
It's just not safe.
A properly installed steel assist handle gives the senior a rigid, unmoving, reliable anchor to grip as they make that perilous transition from sitting to standing. Beyond bearing weight, it provides critical proprioceptive feedback.
Proprioceptive feedback.
Yeah, when they grip that cold steel handle, it sends an immediate physical signal to their brain telling them exactly where their body is in three-dimensional space, helping to counteract the sway.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Furthermore, if they use a daytime mobility aid, a cane, a rollator, a standard walker, it must be staged immediately within arm's reach of the bed. They should never, ever have to take even one single unsupported step to retrieve their walker.
Okay, so the senior has executed the staging. They sat up, their feet were flat at 90 degrees. They counted to 15 to let the blood pressure stabilize. They gripped the solid bed rail, and they stood up into their walker.
Perfect launch.
Right. Now they faced the actual trek down the hallway. But in digging through the geriatric protocols, there is an intervention that is so brilliantly simple, it almost feels like cheating the system entirely.
Yes.
If the actual walking trip to the bathroom is statistically the single most dangerous event of the entire night, you just eliminate the trip.
You neutralize the geography.
Yeah.
You introduce a bedside commode or a handheld urinal.
It sounds incredibly basic.
It does. And frankly, as a caregiver, you will often face intense resistance to this. Seniors naturally resist it at first because of pride, a desire for normalcy, or aesthetic objections to having a toilet in the bedroom.
Sure, which is totally understandable.
Of course. But look at the risk mitigation. If you place a commode right next to the bed, you are reducing a dangerous 30-foot obstacle course in the dark down to a single supported pivot step.
You are completely neutralizing the risk of tripping over a hallway rug, slipping on a wet bathroom tile, or misjudging a door frame.
And for male patients, A handheld urinal kept on the nightstand can mean they do not even have to transition to a standing position, which bypasses the orthostatic hypotension and fall risk entirely.
It is the ultimate circumvention of the danger. But realistically, let's assume they absolutely refuse the commode, which happens all the time, or for whatever medical reason, they must make the physical walk to the bathroom.
Then we have to meticulously engineer the immediate environment they will walk through, starting from the ground up.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the physical interface with the floor footwear.
Allowing bare feet or regular cotton socks at night is a severe hazard. Let's look at the podiatry of aging for a second.
All right. As humans age, the protective fat pads on the plantar surface, the bottom of our feet, thin out significantly. The metatarsal bones sit much closer to the skin.
And the skin itself changes, right?
Yeah, the skin itself loses moisture in its natural, tacky grip. Bare feet on hardwood, laminate, or tile can easily slide. And standard cotton or wool socks are functionally equivalent to wearing ice skates on a smooth floor.
I have seen this so many times. Caregivers put their parents in those thick, fuzzy hospital-style socks because they want to keep their feet warm, or they think the thickness provides padding, but unless those socks have aggressive rubber treading, they are incredibly dangerous.
They remove all friction from the equation. The Launchpad rule is rigid. If feet hit the floor at 2 a.m., they must go directly into non-slip, rubber-soled slippers.
Slippers with a back on them, ideally.
Yes, ideally you want slippers with a closed, structured heel so they cannot slide off mid-step, which creates a tripping hazard in itself. And moving up from the floor, on the nightstand, right next to that steel bed rail, there must be 2 specific items staged every single night.
Their eyeglasses and a manual heavy-duty flashlight.
Exactly.
Eyeglasses make sense. You have to correct baseline visual deficits before they start navigating.
Yeah.
But a flashlight. In the era of smartphones and smart homes, why a manual flashlight?
Because systems fail. Power outages happen during storms. Smart lighting hubs require firmware updates and occasionally drop off the network.
That's just a backup.
Right. A manual flashlight provides the senior with immediate, localized, fail-proof control of their visual environment if the primary systems fail. It is a redundant safety layer.
All right, let's summarize where we are. We have perfected the Launchpad. The rise is staged and controlled. The blood pressure is allowed to stabilize. The feet are gripped in rubber soles. The glasses are on, and the walker is in hand.
But they still have to navigate the house.
Right. If they must walk to the bathroom, the environment they walk through has to be engineered to anticipate their needs without requiring them to think, fumble for switches, or process complex information. We have to engineer the route.
And this hinges entirely on lighting.
And lighting is where so many deeply well-intentioned caregivers get it completely biologically wrong.
They really do. The standard instinct is to go to the big box hardware store, buy a dozen cheap, bright white LED night lights, and plug them into every single outlet from the bed to the bath.
They think more visibility equals more safety.
But standard, bright white, or blue-toned LEDs are endocrinologically disastrous in the middle of the night.
This is a crucial concept, so let's get into the endocrinology here. Why is a standard, bright, blue-toned LED nightlight a biological hazard for an older adult?
It all comes down to a hormone called melatonin, which regulates our circadian rhythms and our sleep-wake architecture. Your brain, specifically the suprachiasmatic nucleus, relies heavily on external light cues to know what time of day it is.
And it gets those cues from the eyes.
Right, from specialized cells in the retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or IPRGCs. These cells contain a photopigment called melanopsin, which is highly, specifically sensitive to short-wavelength light.
Short-wavelength light being blue light, right around 480 nanometers on the electromagnetic spectrum.
Exactly. Throughout the vast majority of human evolution, the only source of bright, cool-toned blue wavelength light was the midday sun.
So when your loved one wakes up at 2 a.m. and their retina detects blue wavelength light from a standard hallway LED,
those IPRGCs fire a signal directly to the pineal gland in the brain, with a hardwired command halt melatonin production immediately.
the brain literally, chemically, thinks the sun just came up.
It receives a biological morning signal. So the senior walks down the hallway to the bathroom, bathed in blue light. Their melatonin production plummets. They use the restroom, they navigate back to the bedroom, they get back in bed, and suddenly their brain is chemically wide awake.
They just stare at the ceiling for 2 hours, unable to fall back into deep sleep.
Right, which completely fragments their sleep architecture for the rest of the night. It leads to severe next-day fatigue, impaired concentration, and physical lethargy.
And ironically, that profound daytime fatigue drastically increases their statistical risk of suffering a fall the following afternoon.
By trying to prevent a nighttime fall with bright blue light, you are chemically engineering a daytime fall.
It's a vicious, invisible cycle. The safety light is actually an endocrine disruptor. So what is the precise lighting prescription for the route?
You must audit the home and swap out all nighttime navigation lights for deep red or warm amber lights, emitting a very low intensity around 10 to 20 lumens.
Why red or amber specifically?
Long wavelength light, the deep reds and ambers pushing past 600 nanometers, has a negligible impact on those melanopsin receptors in the retina. Red light provides enough visual contrast for the brain's visual cortex to map the floor, identify edges, and avoid physical obstacles, but it completely sneaks past the biological wake-up alarm.
It preserves the circulating melatonin.
Yes, allowing the senior to seamlessly transition back into deep restorative sleep the moment their head hits the pillow.
Okay, so the color temperature is vital, red or amber. But placement matters just as much. You can't just stick an amber light at the end of the hall and expect them to navigate the shadows.
No, we need to explore the runaway concept and a professional design strategy called anticipatory illumination.
Anticipatory illumination changes the entire paradigm of how a human interacts with a home. The philosophy is that the light should be waiting for you, rather than you fumbling in the dark, searching for the light switch.
Exactly. You do not want to light a whole room. You only want to light the specific path. The most effective way to achieve this visually is by installing low-voltage LED baseboard strips along the exact floor route from the bed to the toilet.
But these strips should not be glowing continuously all night.
No, you want them triggered by sequential motion sensors.
A chain reaction of light that follows them.
Precisely. Imagine this sequence playing out. You place a pressure mat under the rug, exactly where their feet land when they swing out of bed. The moment their feet apply weight to that mat, it triggers a very dim amber light mounted under the bed frame.
So that is the initial visual anchor.
Right. Then, as they grip their walker and move toward the bedroom door, an infrared motion sensor in the doorway detects their body heat and triggers the hallway baseboard runway lights. As they reach the end of the hall and approach the bathroom, a sensor on the bathroom frame triggers the bathroom light.
The physical environment is actively anticipating their movement, creating a seamless, pre-lit runway that guides them without requiring a single conscious thought.
We also have to manage the actual intensity of that light as they move from room to room using a concept called lumen zoning. This directly addresses the ocular adaptation and pupillary sluggishness we diagnosed earlier.
Right. You cannot have a senior walk out of a dim hallway lit at 10 lumens and step directly into a bathroom that instantly snaps on at 300 lumens.
That sudden violent blast of light overwhelms the retina and causes that temporary glare blindness, which is incredibly disorienting and creates a massive fall hazard right when they're maneuvering around the toilet.
So lumen zoning dictates that we ramp the lights up slowly. How slow is the ramp up?
Typically over a span of about 5 seconds. Using programmable smart dimmers, you choreograph the transition. When the bathroom doorway sensor is triggered, the bathroom light does not snap on at 100% intensity. It turns on at a soft 30% preconditioning level.
And then it builds.
Yes, then over the next 5 continuous seconds, it smoothly brightens up to perhaps 70 or 80%. This gradual, rolling ramp-up perfectly accommodates the slower aging pupillary response. It gives the sphincter pupillae muscle time to constrict, completely preventing that blinding glare.
I have to pause and push back on this a bit because I am putting myself in the shoes of the listener. A pressure mat that talks to an underbed light, that triggers a hallway baseboard array, that triggers a bathroom dimmer on a custom 5-second algorithmic ramp-up. This sounds like outfitting a house for a tech billionaire or a surveillance state.
I get that a lot.
Is this highly complex level of sensor technology truly feasible and practical for an overwhelmed, exhausted family caregiver who is already juggling doctor's appointments, medication schedules, and their own full-time job?
What's fascinating here is it's a vital question, and the answer is that the most reliable safety technology is usually the simplest. When people hear phrases like automated anticipatory lighting, they immediately envision complex smart bulbs, massive localized Wi-Fi routers, smartphone applications, Bluetooth pairing protocols, and constant firmware updates.
Which is a lot to manage.
That represents a massive, unacceptable cognitive load for a caregiver. More importantly, it is highly prone to catastrophic failure. If your internet service provider goes down, or your Wi-Fi router reboots at 2 a.m., your entire safety system goes dark.
Which is absolutely terrifying. You've trained the senior to expect the light, and suddenly it's not there.
It is a critical failure point. In automated safety design, there's an engineering principle called the hierarchy of control. You must design systems that operate entirely locally, completely independent of the internet cloud.
So how do you do that practically?
For the overwhelmed caregiver listening right now, you do not need to hire a smart home technician or buy a central server. You can achieve 90% of the biological and safety benefits using simple, standalone, dumb plug-in motion sensors.
You mean the little plastic blocks you just buy at the local hardware store and plug directly into a wall outlet?
Exactly. You buy a basic motion sensor block, plug it into the wall receptacle, and then you plug a simple amber lamp or a red LED nightlight directly into that block. It requires zero smartphone apps. It requires zero Wi-Fi connection. It has no passwords to remember.
It just works based on body heat.
Right. It relies entirely on local passive infrared detection. It is incredibly cheap. It takes literally 5 seconds to install, and its reliability is exceptionally high because it does not care if your internet router crashes. We always advocate for a layered approach to technology.
Start small.
Start with layer 1. One simple red plug-in motion sensor in the bathroom. See how that changes the nighttime routine. If later on you have the bandwidth and desire to build up to local Zigbee or Z-Wave communication hubs for those sophisticated baseboard runways, you can. But you must establish the low-tech, high-reliability baseline first.
That is deeply reassuring. The technology should reduce the caregiver's anxiety, not become another fragile system they have to manage. Okay, so we have optimized the Launchpad biomechanics, and we have engineered the physical route with anticipatory melatonin-preserving lighting.
But we aren't done.
Right, because fixing the hallway doesn't solve the problem if the person walking down that hallway is chemically compromised from the inside.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have to address what is happening within the senior's bloodstream because certain variables peak precisely when they are attempting to navigate that route. Let's examine the chemical environment and the treacherous landscape of managing medications.
The chemical environment is frequently the hidden, unacknowledged culprit behind nocturnal falls. The environment could be perfectly lit, the bed at a flawless 90-degree angle, and they will still collapse because of what is running through their veins.
We have to confront the hypnotic drug dilemma. Sleep medications.
There is a deeply important, highly rigorously designed study published in Research Square by Oda and colleagues. They look specifically at older patients in acute care hospitals.
To see what was causing falls.
Yes. They analyzed a massive, robust cohort, over 8,000 hospitalized patients over the age of 65, to determine precisely which sleeping pills were causing falls in the middle of the night.
Because, as you touched on with circadian disruption, insomnia is utterly rampant in older adults. Caregivers are desperate to get their loved ones and themselves a full night's sleep, so they plead with doctors for sleep aids.
It is a highly understandable desperation. But the type of sleep aid prescribed is literally a matter of life and death. The researchers meticulously isolated the pharmacological variables, controlling for age, underlying disease, and mobility.
And what do they find?
They found a glaring, undeniable culprit: benzodiazepine receptor agonists. These are your traditional heavy-hitting sleep medications and anti-anxiety drugs. The data showed unequivocally that the administration of these specific drugs was a massive, statistically significant independent risk factor for nighttime falls.
We need to explain the mechanism here. What exactly are benzodiazepine receptor agonists doing to the brain and the body at 2:00 a.m.?
Benzodiazepine receptor agonists work by enhancing the effect of a neurotransmitter called GABA. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Its primary job is to slow down brain activity.
So it puts the brakes on.
Right. When these drugs bind to the GABA receptors, they do two things incredibly forcefully. They heavily sedate the central nervous system, and they induce profound skeletal muscle relaxation.
Wow.
Now imagine our caregiver's scenario. The senior wakes up with a full bladder. They're already battling sleep inertia and orthostatic hypotension. Add to that a brain that is literally bathed in a heavy chemical sedative, causing profound dizziness, confusion, and cognitive fog.
And worse, their skeletal muscles have been chemically relaxed,
Actively removing their muscle tone and degrading the fast-twitch responsiveness required to catch themselves if they stumble. It is a pharmaceutical recipe for physical collapse.
And the timing of the drug's delivery is brutal. The concentration of that sedative in the bloodstream is often at its absolute peak right when they wake up to use the bathroom. But it is exponentially worse for older adults because of how aging organs process chemicals, right? This is pharmacokinetics.
Exactly. Pharmacokinetics is how the body absorbs, distributes, metabolizes, and excretes a drug. As the human body ages, our glomerular filtration rate, how well our kidneys filter waste from the blood, naturally drops.
And the liver slows down too.
Yes, hepatic blood flow and liver enzyme activity decline. They simply do not filter and clear chemicals from the bloodstream as efficiently as they did at age 30. Furthermore, older adults naturally have a higher ratio of body fat to lean muscle, and many benzodiazepines are lipophilic, meaning they dissolve into and hide in fat tissue.
Meaning the drug sticks around much longer.
Yes. A dose of a benzodiazepine that might be completely cleared out of a 30-year-old system in 4 or 5 hours might linger at high, functionally toxic levels in an 80-year-old's bloodstream for 10, 12, or even 16 hours. The half-life is massively extended.
So the chemical is lingering much longer and hitting much harder. Did the Research Square study find any safe alternatives? If a senior genuinely, medically needs help sleeping, what pharmacological options don't induce this profound fall risk?
The study did bring incredibly valuable news on that front. It directly contrasted the benzodiazepines with newer classes of sleep medications, specifically melatonin receptor agonists and orexin receptor antagonists.
Then those were safer.
The data clearly demonstrated that these newer drugs did not increase nocturnal fall risk in the same catastrophic way. They operate on entirely different neurochemical pathways. They help regulate the sleep-wake cycle without hyperstimulating the GABA receptors, meaning they do not induce that severe, floppy muscle relaxation and deep cognitive impairment.
That is a crucial distinction for caregivers to understand. The study also highlighted a specific, highly vulnerable medical population that requires hypervigilance, right?
Yes, the researchers performed a multivariate analysis assessing 24 different risk factors. They found that patients with advanced recurrent malignancies, meaning seniors actively battling advanced returning cancers, were at the absolute highest statistical risk of experiencing falls.
How high was the risk?
The odds ratio was calculated at 2.62, meaning they were more than 2.5 times more likely to fall than other patients in the cohort.
Why are cancer patients specifically so uniquely vulnerable?
It is the compounding effect of multiple severe deficits. You have profound physical frailty and muscle wasting from the disease process. You have severe systemic fatigue. And crucially, you have extreme polypharmacy.
They're on a lot of different medications.
These patients are often on heavy analgesics, opioid pain medications, and antiemetics for nausea, all of which independently cause dizziness and confusion. When you layer a benzodiazepine on top of that existing chemical cocktail, the nervous system simply cannot maintain physical balance. For this specific population, the researchers concluded that prescribing benzodiazepines is extraordinarily dangerous. Their medication management requires constant, meticulous oversight.
And speaking of polypharmacy, the use of multiple medications, we also have to educate the listener on the Magellan Anticholinergic Risk Scale.
This is a vital diagnostic tool used by clinical pharmacists and geriatricians. Anticholinergic drugs work by blocking a specific neurotransmitter called acetylcholine in the central and peripheral nervous system.
And what does acetylcholine do normally?
Acetylcholine is deeply involved in regulating muscle movement, learning, and memory. The problem is that many incredibly common drugs, from over-the-counter allergy medications like diphenhydramine to tricyclic antidepressants to drugs prescribed for overactive bladders, have very strong anticholinergic properties.
So they block those essential signals.
They cause blurry vision, severe cognitive confusion, dry mouth, and dizziness. The Magellan scale rates drugs from 1 to 3 based on this specific anticholinergic burden. If a senior is taking multiple drugs that score a 3 on this scale, their brain is essentially starved of acetylcholine, and their fall risk is drastically elevated.
Okay, I want to interject here because this is a massive stress point for families. Let's ground this in reality. Caregivers are not pharmacologists. You are a daughter or a son, you are exhausted, and you are staring at a plastic weekly pill box filled with 14 different pills prescribed by 3 different specialists who don't talk to each other.
It's completely overwhelming.
You cannot just unilaterally decide to throw away your dad's sleeping pill or adjust his prescriptions because you heard about GABA receptors on an expert guide. How should a family caregiver practically, safely approach modifying this chemical environment?
That is the perfect question. Because the caregiver's role is not to practice unauthorized medicine. It is to be the ultimate advocate, project manager, and data gatherer. You take this exact information and you use it to force a structured conversation with the primary care physician or the geriatrician. You request a formal, comprehensive medication audit.
What does that actually look like in the doctor's office?
You literally put every single pill bottle, over-the-counter supplement, and vitamin in a physical bag. You place it on the doctor's desk, and you drive the agenda. Say, I am deeply concerned about my father's nocturnal fall risk. I want to review this entire list. Are any of these medications benzodiazepine receptor agonists? Can we look for suffixes like PAM or LAM?
Like diazepam, lorazepam, or alprazolam.
Exactly. Teach yourself to spot those suffixes. You ask the doctor, do any of these drugs have a high Magellan anticholinergic risk score? If he absolutely needs a sleep aid, can we safely taper him off the benzo and switch to a melatonin or orexin receptor antagonist?
And you mentioned timing before, too.
Yes, importantly, you ask about optimizing the dosing schedule. Can we change the time of day he takes his blood pressure medication so the peak hypotensive side effects happen while he's in deep sleep, rather than peaking at 2 a.m. right when he gets up to use the bathroom?
You bring the specific vocabulary to the doctor to trigger a rigorous review. You don't ask for generic safety advice, you ask for chemical optimization.
Exactly. You ask the physician to actively deprescribe unnecessary medications or optimize the remaining ones. You must also ask about tapering protocols, because abruptly stopping a benzodiazepine can cause severe rebound insomnia and withdrawal seizures. You must partner with a doctor to engineer the chemical environment just as carefully as you engineered the lighting.
All right, this is incredibly empowering information. We have optimized the Launchpad biomechanics, we've designed a bioadaptive lighting route, and we've audited the bloodstream to remove chemical hazards. But everything we have systematically discussed so far is predicated on one massive, load-bearing assumption: that the senior actually knows where they're going and why they're getting out of bed.
Yes, the entire safety net relies on the assumption of rational intent.
Exactly. It assumes they are getting up to use the commode and go back to sleep. But what happens when cognitive decline, specifically dementia or Alzheimer's disease, completely scrambles those basic facts?
That changes everything.
What if they aren't getting up to use the bathroom, but because their decaying brain tells them it's 1985, they are 30 years old, and they have to go warm up the car for work? This brings us to the most complex overlay of all: wandering and sundowning. These are the specific behaviors that keep caregivers awake at night, staring at the something in sheer terror.
And justifiably so. When a neurodegenerative disease like dementia enters the picture, standard physical fall prevention is no longer remotely sufficient. We are now dealing with disorientation, delusion, and elopement. To build a checklist for this, let's start with sundowning, because it is usually the behavioral catalyst that sets the stage for the nighttime chaos.
What exactly is sundowning at a biological neurological level?
Sundowning is the clinical exacerbation of neuropsychiatric symptoms: agitation, severe anxiety, delusions, aggressive pacing, that predictably and cyclically occurs in the late afternoon and early evening hours.
And why does it happen then?
It is deeply tied to the physical, microscopic degradation of the brain. Autopsy studies of Alzheimer's patients show a disproportionate, aggressive loss of neurons in a specific, tiny structure in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN.
The SCN is essentially the brain's master biological clock, right?
Yes, it is the master pacemaker. It sits right above where the optic nerves cross, and it uses those light signals from the eyes to regulate our entire 24-hour circadian rhythm. In a dementia patient, the SCN is physically dying. The clock's gears are literally rusting and breaking.
And that messes up their neurotransmitters.
Right. Add to that a severe disruption in cholinergic neurotransmission, the brain chemicals responsible for maintaining focused attention and calm, and the brain fundamentally loses its ability to orient itself in time.
There is a specific clinical framework used to manage this called the PLST model, which I found absolutely fascinating because it explains the trigger: the progressively lowered stress threshold.
The PLST model is vital for caregivers to internalize. Imagine the dementia patient's baseline ability to process external stress as a bucket. Because their brain is physically damaged and losing mass, their bucket is much, much smaller than ours.
Okay, a smaller bucket.
Furthermore, they suffer from sensory gating deficits. A healthy brain automatically filters out background noise, the hum of a refrigerator, the shadows on the wall. A dementia brain cannot filter it out. It processes every sensory input as an immediate threat.
So their bucket fills up much faster.
Exactly. Throughout the day, normal stimuli, noisy television, mild physical pain from arthritis, hunger, general fatigue, fill that small bucket. By late afternoon, right as their damaged circadian rhythms are naturally dipping and their physical fatigue is peaking, the bucket overflows. Their stress threshold is breached.
And that causes the episode.
When that threshold is breached, executive function and emotional regulation completely catastrophically break down, resulting in a severe sundowning episode.
So management isn't about stopping the episode once it starts. It's about keeping the bucket from overflowing in the first place. What is the specific daily checklist for mitigating sundowning?
It requires highly regimented environmental and behavioral control throughout the day. First, you must maximize bright, cool-toned sunlight exposure in the early afternoon.
To give the brain a strong daytime signal.
Right, you want to bombard the retina with lux to give that damaged SCN whatever strong light cues it can still faintly process to anchor it to daytime. Second, enforce structured, light aerobic exercise during the midday to ensure genuine physiological tiredness, not just lethargy. Third, strictly eliminate late daytime naps, which cannibalize the homeostatic sleep drive they need for the night.
And music therapy is a surprisingly robust part of the intervention too, isn't it?
Yes, specifically anticipatory music therapy. You do not wait for the agitation to start. You track their behavior for a week and figure out exactly what time the sundowning usually begins. Let's say it predictably hits at 4:30 p.m.
So you start before that.
Right. At 3:30 p.m., a full hour before the threshold breaches, you start playing soothing, highly familiar music from their early youth. This acts as a powerful emotional anchor and a cognitive distraction, soothing the amygdala before the bucket can overflow.
And what about pharmacological intervention for sundowning? The clinical literature mentions melatonin, but the dosing level suggested frankly seemed shocking to me.
This is a crucial, highly specific point for advanced dementia care. In a healthy adult dealing with mild jet lag, a standard over-the-counter melatonin dose is maybe 1 to 3 milligrams.
Right.
But for refractory, severe sundowning in advanced dementia patients, the clinical literature suggests titrating melatonin starting at 10 milligrams and slowly increasing weekly up to a maximum of 30 milligrams.
Wait, 30 milligrams? I have to aggressively question this. A normal dose is maybe 2 or 3 milligrams? Isn't flooding an elderly, frail senior's brain with 30 milligrams of synthetic hormone going to cause a massive groggy hangover effect the next morning? Doesn't that entirely defeat the purpose of fall prevention by making them heavily sedated the next day?
It is a totally valid concern, and it highlights the difference between treating a healthy brain and treating a severely diseased one. In a healthy brain, 30 milligrams would indeed cause profound next-day lethargy.
So why is it different here?
But in a late-stage dementia brain, the SCN and the pineal gland are so severely decayed that the brain's natural endogenous melatonin production is virtually non-existent. Furthermore, the receptors themselves have degraded. You are having to flood the system with a massive dose of synthetic hormone just to register a faint biological signal through the damage.
You aren't supplementing, you are entirely overriding a broken system.
However, and this is a massive critical caveat, a family caregiver must never, ever attempt this high-dose titration on their own. Buying a bottle of pills and giving a senior 30 milligrams is incredibly dangerous. This specific protocol must be explicitly directed, titrated, and closely monitored by a neurologist or a geriatric psychiatrist to manage the exact side effects you mentioned.
Absolutely. Okay, so if sundowning is the late afternoon agitation, wandering is the midnight terror. The clinical academic term is critical elopement. Just how dangerous is this behavior?
The statistics are horrifying. Critical wandering incidents, where a dementia patient leaves the safe perimeter of the home and becomes genuinely lost, have a 20% mortality rate if they're not located quickly.
20%?
Yes, they succumb to environmental exposure, hypothermia, traffic accidents, or drowning in local bodies of water. The highest statistical risk is for individuals with severe cognitive impairment, specifically those scoring 13 or lower on the Mini-Mental State Exam, or MMSE, which is a standard diagnostic test for cognitive function.
So how do we physically stop it? You can't just bolt the doors and lock them in a room.
No, absolutely not. Ethically, legally, and practically, you must never lock a dementia patient alone in a room or a house. Fire safety alone dictates that is a fatal strategy.
So what do you do?
Management has to be highly tailored and stratified based on the type of wandering, because not all wandering is driven by the exact same neurological impulse. Clinical behavioral analyses group wanderers into 3 distinct categories based on their retained cognition and their neuropsychiatric symptoms, or NPS.
Let's walk through the checklist for managing each specific group. Group 1, high cognition, low NPS.
These individuals are typically in the earlier, milder stages of cognitive decline. They generally know who they are and where they live. They mostly wander only when they are placed in unfamiliar, disorienting environments, like a crowded hotel, a new grocery store, or an airport.
So how do you manage them?
The primary solution here is vigilant supervision in new environments and passive technological monitoring. This is where you utilize GPS wearables, smartwatches, or smartphone tracking apps. Because their cognition is still relatively high and they aren't deeply agitated, they usually retain enough awareness to not rip the tracking watch off their wrist.
Group 2. Low cognition, low NPS.
These patients are much further along in their cognitive decline, but crucially, they are not deeply agitated or delusional. They wander out of sheer boredom, a lack of physical stimulation, or a vague, restless need to go somewhere. It's a continuous, aimless pacing.
So they just need an outlet.
Exactly. The solution here is structured, exhaustive daytime engagement. You utilize adult daycare programs, hire companion caregivers, and enforce highly supervised, rigorous walking routines. You have to safely, physically burn off that kinetic energy during the daylight hours so they do not try to burn it off at 3 a.m.
And then we reach group 3, low cognition, high NPS. This has to be the most volatile and dangerous group.
Yes, without question. These individuals have severe cognitive decline accompanied by intense agitation and profound delusions, specifically persecutory delusions. They are wandering because they are utterly terrified.
What are they terrified of?
Their broken brain is telling them that intruders are breaking into the house, or they believe they have to urgently go rescue their deceased mother from a fire.
And you can't reason with that level of delusion. You can't just gently say, Mom, it's 3 a.m. You are safe in your house and your mother passed away 40 years ago.
Logic and reality orientation completely fail because their visual cortex and amygdala are projecting an entirely different, terrifying reality. For this group, GPS watches are useless because they will angrily cut them off. You must rely on heavy environmental interventions. And surprisingly, this is where low-tech psychological design tricks are incredibly effective.
Like what?
For example, placing a 2-foot-wide strip of solid black tape or black mat on the floor directly in front of the exit doors.
Why does black tape stop a highly agitated wanderer?
Because advanced dementia physically alters the brain's visuospatial processing centers in the occipital and parietal lobes. They lose contrast sensitivity and depth perception. To a healthy brain, it is obviously just black tape on linoleum. But to a late-stage dementia patient's compromised visual processing, that dark black strip looks like a gaping hole, a deep trench, or a steep drop-off.
Wait, really?
Yes, it triggers a primal fear of falling. They will stubbornly refuse to step over it.
That is wild. You are intentionally hacking their neurologically altered perception to keep them safely inside.
Exactly. It uses their own visual deficits as a safety barrier. You also manipulate the physical environment by hiding the mechanics of exit. You move the deadbolt up to the very top edge of the door frame, completely out of their normal downward-facing field of vision. Or you install visually camouflaging murals over the exit doors, like a large decal that makes the door look exactly like a bookshelf or a blank wall.
If the brain doesn't process it as an exit, the impulse to open it decreases. But exploring these interventions brings up a profoundly complex question, an ethical tension that caregivers struggle with constantly.
It does.
When we talk about intentionally hiding locks, painting fake bookshelves over exit doors to deceive them, and slapping GPS tracking devices on their ankles, are we protecting them, or are we slowly turning their own home into a psychological prison? How does a family caregiver reconcile the intense, desperate need for physical safety with the fundamental human right to dignity, freedom, and autonomy?
It is the most agonizing, soul-crushing tightrope a caregiver has to walk. And I want to validate that there is no easy, universally correct answer. The ethical tension between autonomy, the right to make your own choices, and beneficence, the duty to protect someone from harm, is profound in geriatric care.
Because both extremes are dangerous.
Right. If you prioritize autonomy and let them wander freely, the data says they could die of hypothermia. If you lock them in a visually deceptive environment, you strip them of their fundamental humanity and agency. The consensus in geriatric care ethics is that you must constantly, daily weigh the immediate physical danger against the restriction of liberty. You must always continually adjust to choose the least restrictive option that guarantees survival.
And practically, how do you soften that restriction? How do you maintain safety without building a fortress?
By actively expanding the safety net beyond the physical walls of the house. You do not just rely on surveillance cameras and hidden locks. You implement a proactive neighborhood awareness plan.
Getting the community involved.
Yes. You go to your immediate neighbors, you explain the specific medical diagnosis, you give them a recent clear photograph of your loved one, and you ask them to keep an eye out. You formally enroll in a safe return program like Medical Alert or a local Silver Alert registry, which proactively registers their physical details, their typical wandering routes, and their medical needs with local law enforcement. You weave the surrounding community into the safety plan, so the burden of protection isn't solely resting on the home's architecture or the caregiver's vigilance.
Which brings us to the ultimate foundational load-bearing pillar in this entire safety structure: the caregiver themselves. Everything we have discussed in exhaustive detail today, the staging of the Launchpad, the installation of anticipatory lighting, the demanding conversations for medication audits, the rigorous daily sundowning schedules, the neighborhood awareness, it all requires a human being to execute it.
And if that human being is exhausted,
The entire system collapses instantly. We have to look at caregiver strategies and live-in models.
we cannot overstate this. Caregiver burnout is a direct, highly quantifiable safety hazard for the senior. It is not just an emotional issue. It is a mechanical failure of the safety net.
So what happens when they get burnt out?
If you, the caregiver, are jolted awake 3 or 4 times a night for months on end to manage bathroom trips, you will rapidly develop chronic sleep deprivation. Your cortisol levels spike, your reaction times slow down to the equivalent of being legally intoxicated, your immune system crashes, and your emotional patience completely evaporates.
You can't function like that.
You cannot implement a complex, nuanced safety checklist if you are functionally impaired from exhaustion. Getting professional help is not a luxury or a sign of failure. It is a mandatory, vital item on the fall prevention checklist.
But navigating the landscape of professional home care is incredibly confusing for families. People hear the phrase 24-hour care, and they naturally assume that means a professional is awake and intensely staring at their parent 24 hours a day.
That assumption leads to massive logistical failures. We need to clearly break down the mechanics of the specific care models, primarily live-in care versus 24-hour shift care. Let's start with the live-in model, which is highly popular because it is generally more affordable.
How does that one work?
In a live-in model, a single caregiver resides in the home for several days at a time. They are contracted to work 10 to 12 active hours during the daylight hours, cooking meals, managing hygiene, dispensing medications, maintaining the sundowning routine. But, dictated by strict labor laws and basic human physiological necessity, that live-in caregiver must be provided an uninterrupted 8-hour sleep period at night.
So they are actively sleeping exactly when the senior might be getting up.
Yes, they must be provided a private room and a bed. However, the crucial distinction of this model is that they are present in the home for acute emergencies. If the senior triggers the bed alarm at 2 a.m., the live-in caregiver wakes up, responds to the room, physically assists them to the commode, ensures they are safe, and gets them back into bed.
It provides a robust safety net for occasional, unpredictable nighttime awakenings.
Exactly.
But what if it's not occasional? What if the senior has severe, unmanaged nocturia or late-stage dementia, and they are triggering that alarm 4, 5, or 6 times a single night?
Then the live-in model fundamentally breaks down and becomes hazardous. A live-in caregiver cannot safely, competently manage the senior's complex medical needs for 12 hours during the day if their mandatory 8-hour sleep period is shattered 5 times a night. They will experience microsleeps during the day and burn out in a week.
So what's the alternative if they are highly active at night?
If the senior is restless or pacing at night, you must transition away from live-in care to a hybrid approach or full continuous shift care.
Meaning you hire dedicated shift workers.
Exactly. You hire an awake overnight shift worker, a professional who arrives at, say, 8:00 p.m., stays fully awake, alert, and dressed all night, actively monitoring the senior, managing the wandering, and assisting with bathroom trips. And then they leave at 8 a.m. when the fresh daytime caregiver arrives.
It is significantly more expensive, though.
Because you are paying hourly rates for constant consciousness, yes. But if the wandering risk is high or the nocturnal bathroom trips are constant, an awake, alert professional is the only physiological way to guarantee safety while allowing the family to sleep.
Because if the family doesn't sleep, absolutely nobody is safe. You have to secure your own oxygen mask first, or you are useless to the person you are trying to protect.
Precisely. You cannot be a competent project manager and an advocate with the doctor or an engineer of the home environment if you are drowning in chronic sleep debt.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today, diving deep into the physiological, environmental, and chemical realities of home care. Let's synthesize this journey. We started by dissecting the unyielding biology of waking in the dark, understanding how sleep inertia disrupts the motor cortex, how baroreceptors fail to maintain blood pressure, and how the aging eye is blinded by glare.
And then we moved to the solutions.
Right. We engineered a precise physical launchpad to control the momentum of the rise and wait out the dizziness. We designed a bioadaptive route, utilizing anticipatory amber lighting to preserve melatonin and guide the path. We rigorously audited the chemical environment, targeting the hidden dangers of benzodiazepines and polypharmacy.
Which is such a common pitfall.
We tackled the complex overlay of dementia, learning to manage the overflowing bucket of sundowning and stratifying wandering risk with visual tricks and community nets. And finally, we fortified the caregiver with structural support models to ensure the system doesn't collapse from exhaustion.
It is a comprehensive, multi-layered system. But to you, the listener, the caregiver sitting at home feeling utterly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of this checklist, you do not have to implement this entire architecture tomorrow.
You really don't. Pick just one single thing.
Tonight, swap out that glaring blue nightlight in the hallway for a warm amber one. Or tomorrow morning, take a tape measure. Sit your loved one on the edge of the bed and check the height to ensure their feet rest perfectly flat at a 90-degree angle.
One small, strategic biomechanical change dramatically shifts the odds in your favor. Just one thing. That is how you start building the net. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that recontextualizes this entire effort.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We spent this whole time talking about senior-proofing a house. We treat these interventions anticipatory lighting that softly guides your path, floors entirely free of trip hazards, environments that support our natural circadian rhythms instead of fighting them, as if they are special clinical accommodations meant only for the frail and declining.
Right, like it's a hospital room.
But think about it deeply. If we design our homes to seamlessly, bioadaptively support the most vulnerable among us, aren't we actually designing the optimal, healthiest home for humans of any age? Maybe senior proofing isn't about managing decline at all. Maybe it is simply the gold standard for human-centric living, a design philosophy that respects our biology rather than ignoring it.
That is a profound perspective shift. Designing an environment for vulnerability ultimately creates a space where every human nervous system thrives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. We hope this guide brings you actionable clarity, precise strategy, and above all, a peaceful, safe night's sleep for you and your loved ones. Take care.